It's a story that made national headlines. A Los Angeles police detective found guilty of murder. Eyewitness News covered this horrific case extensively. Prosecutors say Stephanie Lazarus didn't commit a crime of passion, but a deliberate killing. And now, years after her conviction, Lazarus won't be granted parole. Eyewitness News reporter Carlos Granda has new reaction.
Stephanie Lazarus will not be released from prison, at least for now. A panel decided to rescind her parole. Experts say it's a unique case.
The room was quiet, too quiet. A broken vase lay shattered across the floor. Drawers were pulled open, furniture slightly out of place, and in the middle of it all, a young woman lying motionless. There were signs of a struggle, not just any struggle, the kind that turns violent fast. Whoever did this didn't just want to steal. They stayed, they fought, and they made sure she wouldn't survive. But here's what makes this case even more disturbing. The person responsible already knew how investigations worked, and for more than 20 years, they got away with it. In today's case, we're diving into one of the most chilling true crime stories out of Los Angeles, the murder of Sherri Rasmussen. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. Van Nuys, Los Angeles, California, February 24, 1986. Inside a quiet condominium in Van Nuys, Los Angeles, 29-year-old Sherri Rasmussen was found brutally murdered. She had just gotten married. Her life was only beginning, and yet, inside her own home, it all came to a violent end. At first, police believed it was a robbery. The scene seemed to support it. Drawers opened, items disturbed, even her car was missing. But something about this crime didn't sit right. The violence was too personal, the struggle too intense. And the biggest question of all, why would a robbery turn into something this brutal? Because this wasn't random, this wasn't chance. The killer knew exactly what they were doing. Before her name became attached to one of Los Angeles' most haunting murder cases, Sherri Rasmussen was known for something entirely different. She was known for competence. She was known for discipline. She was known for compassion under pressure. Born on February 7, 1957, Sherri Rasmussen built a life defined by purpose. She was not drifting through her 20s trying to figure out who she was. By the mid-1980s, she already knew. She had chosen a demanding profession, committed herself to it, and earned a level of responsibility many people spend decades chasing. At Glendale Adventist Medical Center in California, Sherri served as Director of Critical Care Nursing. It was a position that did not go to the careless or the indecisive. Critical care is where seconds matter. It is where leadership cannot be faked. It is where calm has to exist in the middle of fear. The people who worked around her saw that. The patients who depended on that system felt it, whether they knew her name or not. She was still young, but her life already reflected order, momentum, and achievement. And beyond her professional success, there was something else beginning to take shape: a marriage, a future, a home. In November of 1985, Sherri married John Rutan, an engineer. Their marriage was still new in early 1986. They were at that fragile and hopeful stage where ordinary things still carry a special weight. Shared routines feel exciting. Future plans feel close enough to touch. A home is not just where you live. It becomes the first real expression of the life you are building together. To outside observers, Sherri's life appeared to be entering a bright new chapter. She had the career. She had the marriage. She had stability. She had direction. And that matters in a story like this because true crime is often distorted by what comes after. The violence becomes so central that the life before it is reduced to a few bullet points, a photograph, a date of birth, and a tragic ending. But if you stop there, you miss the most important part. Sherri Rasmussen was not a symbol waiting for a crime to happen to her. She was a person living a real life. She was a daughter, a professional, a newlywed, a woman entering a season that should have been filled with possibility. By early 1986, there was every reason to believe that her life was opening, not closing. That is what makes what happened next so devastating. Because the more complete her life appears in the beginning, the more disturbing the ending becomes. And in this case, that contrast is impossible to ignore. On one side, you have a woman whose future seemed to be organizing itself into something stable and meaningful. On the other, you have a violence so personal, so intimate, and so deliberate, that it would eventually force investigators, attorneys, journalists, and the public to ask the same question over and over again. Who could hate this much? Who could carry that kind of rage into the home of a newly married woman? And who could do it in a way that suggested this was never just about anger in the moment, but something deeper, something older, something unresolved? At the center of that question is the life Sherri had built. Because sometimes in true crime, the motive is hidden in wealth, inheritance, business, or secrecy. But sometimes the motive grows in plain sight, quietly, inside the ordinary milestones of another person's happiness. A new marriage, a new home, a future chosen, and somewhere beyond that bright beginning, another person was watching it happen. A person connected to the past. A person who, for reasons that would take decades to fully unravel, could not let go. Long before Sherri Rasmussen married John Ruetten, there was another woman in his life. Her name was Stephanie Lazarus. The two met at UCLA in Los Angeles, during the period between 1978 and the early 1980s. At that point, they were young, educated, and moving through the same social world. Their relationship belonged to an earlier chapter of John's life, a chapter that should have remained exactly that, earlier. But relationships do not always end cleanly just because time passes. Some endings are official on paper and unfinished in the mind. And according to what would later emerge, this was not simply a past romance that had faded into memory. There were lingering feelings, continued emotional attachment, a difficulty, on at least one side, with accepting that the relationship had ended and that John Ruetten had moved on. By 1983, Stephanie Lazarus had joined the Los Angeles Police Department. That detail would mean little to most people at the time. It would have sounded like a career fact, a professional milestone, nothing more. But years later, that single detail would transform the entire case. Because when investigators and the public finally looked back, they would realize that the woman tied to the victim's husband was not just an ex-girlfriend from the past. She was a police officer. She understood procedure. She understood how crime scenes were interpreted. She understood what investigators looked for and, maybe more importantly, what they often overlooked. Still, in the early 1980s, none of that was visible. What was visible was simpler and more human. A past relationship. A man moving forward. A woman who may not have accepted it as fully as everyone else assumed she had. And then Sherri entered the picture. This is where tension begins to sharpen. Not loud tension, not theatrical tension, the more dangerous kind. Quiet, personal, emotional tension. The kind that does not always announce itself with threats or dramatic scenes. Sometimes it shows up in disapproval, in lingering attachment, in difficulty adjusting to what another person has chosen. And what John Ruetten had chosen was a future with Sherri Rasmussen. As that future became more real, as the relationship matured, and especially once marriage entered the picture, the emotional meaning of that decision changed. It was no longer casual. It was no longer temporary. It was permanent enough to force reality into the open. He had moved on. He had chosen someone else. For one person, that reality may have been impossible to accept. This is one of the reasons this story continues to grip people decades later, because jealousy in true crime is never compelling on its own. What makes it compelling is the degree to which it mutates. It stops being disappointment and becomes fixation. It stops being sadness and becomes grievance. It stops being private heartbreak and becomes something dangerous. A person begins to believe that another person's happiness is not simply unfortunate. It becomes offensive, unfair, intolerable. And in the Rasmussen case, the tension between past and present seems to follow that darker pattern. Sherri represented more than a rival. She represented the life someone else had been denied, or believed they had been denied. Marriage made that reality undeniable. The domestic life she was building with John turned an old emotional wound into something active, something personnel, something humiliating. And humiliation, when mixed with obsession, can become explosive. There is another reason this chapter matters. True crime often asks viewers to wait for a reveal, to hold their curiosity until the identity of the killer arrives like a twist. But in this case, the psychological roots of the crime seem to begin long before the murder itself, long before the crime scene, long before the cold case, long before DNA. The roots begin here, at UCLA, in a relationship that ended, in a future that moved forward without one of the people who expected to share it, and in a refusal to accept that the story had changed. By the time Sherri Rasmussen entered her marriage in late 1985, that older emotional history had not disappeared. It had simply gone underground, which is often where the most dangerous motives begin. February 24, 1986. Van Nuys, Los Angeles. Inside the condo Sherri Rasmussen shared with her husband, something violent happened. Sherri was home alone that day. At some point during those hours, the ordinary safety of her home became the setting for a brutal attack. We do not need exact minute-by-minute certainty to understand the reality of what occurred. What matters is what the physical evidence would later show. This was not sudden, efficient violence. This was a struggle. Sherri was beaten severely. She was shot 3 times. There were signs that she fought back. There were indications of attempted restraint. And on her arm, one detail would survive the years: a bite mark. That bite mark would eventually become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. But on that day, it was simply one more sign of how close, how chaotic, and how intensely personal the attack had been. Because bite marks do not belong to distant violence. They belong to struggle, to panic, to contact at close range, to rage that crosses every boundary of space and restraint. The home itself offered its own silent testimony. This was not the scene of a clean execution. It was messy, physical, emotional. A fight had taken place. The victim had not simply been surprised and eliminated. She had been overpowered in an encounter that carried a disturbing amount of force. And that distinction matters. A random intruder can bring violence into a home, but the nature of the violence often reveals intent. Here, the force was excessive. The encounter was intimate. The injuries pointed to more than opportunity. They pointed to emotion. That is one of the first great tensions in this case. On the surface, some parts of the scene could be made to resemble a robbery. But the body told another story. The struggle told another story. The bite mark told another story. This was not just about theft. This was not just about getting in and getting out. This was personal. Somewhere inside that condo, Sherri Rasmussen encountered someone who was not there by accident. Someone who either came prepared for confrontation or became willing to escalate into murder once the confrontation began. And perhaps the most haunting part of this chapter is the setting itself, home. There is something uniquely disturbing about violence that happens in a place designed for safety. It changes how the case is remembered. A street can feel dangerous. A parking lot can feel exposed. But a home represents control, privacy, boundaries, the small circle where life is supposed to remain intact. In this case, that circle was broken from the inside. The attack left behind more than physical damage. It left behind a question that would define the investigation for decades. Who entered that home, engaged in such a violent struggle, and left the scene looking enough like a burglary to misdirect the first theory of the crime? Because this is where the story begins to divide into 2 separate truths. The first truth is what happened. The second truth is what the scene appeared to suggest. And for years, those 2 truths would not align. Sherri Rasmussen died on February 24, 1986, in her own home, after a brutal and deeply personal attack. That much was real from the beginning. What took far longer to understand was who had brought that violence into her life, and why the first interpretation of the scene failed to capture the emotional reality of the crime. When police examined the scene, they found details that seemed to support a familiar theory. Drawers had been opened, items inside the home were disturbed, and Sherri's BMW was missing. Later, that car would be recovered. Taken together, these facts pointed investigators toward an explanation that was simple, recognizable, and, at first glance, plausible: a botched burglary. It is easy to understand why that theory took hold. Burglary gives chaos a structure. It explains movement through the home. It explains disorder. It explains property being taken. It offers law enforcement an immediate framework, one that fits many violent home invasions. But the longer this case is examined, the more that framework begins to crack, because what investigators saw may have resembled a burglary. What the violence suggested was something else: minimal theft, extreme brutality, a prolonged struggle, a level of force that did not match a quick property crime. This is where staging becomes one of the central ideas in the case. Staging does not mean every element is fake. It means real violence is arranged inside a misleading narrative. Enough details are left behind to push investigators toward a convenient interpretation. The goal is not perfection. The goal is direction. Make the scene look close enough to a robbery, and people may stop asking whether the victim herself was the true target. And in Sherri Rasmussen's case, that possibility is impossible to ignore. If this had been a straightforward burglary, why the degree of personal violence? Why the severity of the beating? Why the close contact struggle? Why the bite mark? Why does the scene feel less like an interruption during a theft, and more like the victim became the entire focus? These questions did not disappear just because the robbery theory was accepted. They remained inside the evidence, waiting for someone to take them seriously. The missing BMW helped the burglary explanation survive. A stolen vehicle creates momentum for that narrative. It says, property mattered here, possessions mattered here, but even that detail raises uncomfortable possibilities. A car can be taken because it is valuable. It can also be taken because it helps complete a story, because it adds realism to a staged scene, because it gives the perpetrator distance and time. The problem with staging, in many true crime cases, is that it often works best in the beginning. In the first hours, when investigators need coherence, when grief is fresh, when evidence has not yet been tested deeply enough to expose contradictions. In those early moments, the broad shape of a scene can overpower the specific meaning of its details. That appears to be what happened here. The disorder was visible. The missing car was visible. The violence, though visible, was interpreted through the wrong lens. And once investigators commit to a theory early, that theory can begin to control what they notice, what they dismiss, and what they fail to pursue. This chapter is not just about a crime scene, it is about narrative power, because whoever killed Sherri Rasmussen did not only commit violence, that person also left behind an argument embedded in the room. This was a robbery, this was random, this was not personal, and for years that argument held. But the scene itself never completely agreed. It looked like a robbery, but it did not feel like one. From the very beginning, not everyone accepted the burglary theory. Among those who pushed back most forcefully was Nuys Rasmussen, Sherri's father. For grieving families, suspicion can come from emotion, instinct, or refusal to accept an easy answer. But sometimes those suspicions are grounded in something more concrete. Knowledge of the victim's life, knowledge of the people around her, knowledge of tensions that law enforcement may not fully understand in the first hours of an investigation. Nuys Rasmussen did not simply grieve his daughter. He questioned the official narrative. Again and again he raised concerns. And among the names that surfaced early was Stephanie Lazarus. That fact would become one of the most haunting elements of the case, because the woman who would later be identified through DNA was not some unknown figure whose existence was discovered decades later. Her name existed near the case from the start, but being named is not the same as being pursued. And in 1986, Stephanie Lazarus was not seriously pursued in the way a case like this demanded. That failure sits at the emotional center of the Rasmussen family's long fight for justice, because from their perspective, the path not taken was visible almost immediately. If the crime felt personal, then the victim's relationships mattered. The husband's history mattered. The emotional landscape around the marriage mattered. So why did that line of inquiry not deepen the way it should have? That question has followed this case ever since. Was it tunnel vision? Was it institutional failure? Was it the power of a burglary theory that took hold too early and never loosened its grip? Or did the fact that the person being named was a police officer create a barrier, subtle or not, that shaped how seriously she was considered? These questions are part of why the case never faded completely from public memory. It was not just a cold case. It became, over time, a case that seemed to contain warning signs from the beginning. Warning signs that were not fully followed. Warning signs that a family kept pointing to while the official story moved elsewhere. To understand the pain of this chapter, you have to imagine what it means to live with that knowledge. To lose a daughter. To believe the wrong theory has taken over. To point toward a person you believe should be investigated. And then to watch that person continue living freely for years. That is not ordinary grief. That is grief mixed with helplessness. Grief mixed with doubt, grief mixed with the unbearable possibility that justice is slipping away, not because the truth is unknowable, but because the truth is being overlooked. Nuys Rasmussen's persistence matters because cold cases do not survive on evidence alone. They also survive because someone refuses to let them disappear. Someone keeps speaking the victim's name. Someone keeps challenging the official version when others have moved on. In this case, that persistence would eventually be vindicated. But in 1986, none of that had happened yet. In 1986, the name was there, Stephanie Lazarus. And it did not go anywhere. As the years passed, the case did not move toward resolution, but Stephanie Lazarus moved forward. Within the Los Angeles Police Department, she continued her career. She did not live under public suspicion. She did not become the center of an urgent investigation. She remained inside the institution, building a professional life while the murder of Sherri Rasmussen remained officially unresolved. Over time, she became a detective and worked in specialized units. That detail changes the emotional geometry of the story. Because unresolved murders are frightening on their own, they create uncertainty. They leave families without closure. They remind the public that some killers disappear into ordinary life. But this case is darker than that. The person eventually tied to the murder was not hidden from the system. She was inside it. The institution responsible for solving violent crime employed her. That reality is one of the reasons this case has endured so powerfully in the public imagination. It does not merely present a mystery. It presents an inversion. The line between investigator and suspect, protector and perpetrator, is turned inside out, and that inversion forces deeper questions. What does it mean for a murder case when the person closest to the truth has professional knowledge of how police think? What does it mean when the suspect understands evidence, procedure, and the habits of an investigation? What does it mean when time is passing, careers are advancing, and the unresolved crime remains behind, buried under paperwork, memory, and misdirection? The answer is disturbing. It means the crime does not just remain unsolved. It becomes protected by time, by routine, by institutional drift, by the assumption that old cases stay old because there is nothing more to find. This chapter is where the moral shock of the story deepens. Up until now, it is possible to view the case as a tragic failure of interpretation, a personal crime mistaken for a burglary, a promising lead not properly followed, a family left unheard. But once you add the fact that Stephanie Lazarus remained in the LAPD, the case becomes something else. It becomes a story about proximity. The suspect was not far from the machinery of justice. She was close to it, working within it, advancing through it. And for the Rasmussen family, that must have been unbearable beyond words. Every year that passed without resolution made the original failure harder to correct. Memories fade, evidence ages, people retire, leads weaken, public attention shifts. The coldness of a cold case is not just about lack of movement. It is about distance accumulating between the crime and the possibility of accountability. Yet in this case, one impossible truth remained alive in the background. The woman connected to the victim's husband had become part of the police system itself, a system that had not solved the murder, a system that had not seriously pursued her, a system she now served from the inside. That is why this chapter lands with such force in a true crime narrative. It reveals the scale of the failure without needing exaggeration. It does not require conspiracy language to feel alarming. The facts are enough. The person closest to the truth was inside the system, and for years, nobody stopped her. From 1986 to 2008, the murder of Sherri Rasmussen remained unsolved. More than 2 decades passed. Think about what that really means. Seasons changed, administrations changed, careers advanced, people aged. Technologies evolved. The city itself changed around the memory of the crime. But the central fact remained untouched. A 29-year-old woman had been murdered in her home, and no one had been held accountable. Cold cases create a strange kind of silence. At first, there is urgency. Then there are theories. Then there are follow-ups. But as time stretches, the energy around a case changes. The public forgets. Files settle deeper into storage. Names become less immediate. Unless a family keeps pushing, a murder can begin to feel as though it belongs more to the past than to justice. That is what makes the Rasmussen family's persistence so important. They did not let the case disappear emotionally, even when it had disappeared institutionally. For them, time did not soften what had happened. Time sharpened the injustice. Every year without an arrest made the unanswered questions heavier. Every year made the early failures more painful. Every year reinforced the sense that something crucial had been missed. And meanwhile, the official status of the case remained what cold cases so often become: unresolved, distant, suspended between tragedy and neglect. This stretch of time is essential in the rhythm of the story, because it creates the emotional desert the audience must cross before the breakthrough can matter. Without those lost years, The later DNA match would be satisfying. With them, it becomes seismic. 20-plus years is long enough for people to assume a case will never be solved. Long enough for a killer to feel safe. Long enough for even obvious emotional truths to be buried beneath procedural closure. For the Rasmussen family, those decades were not abstract. They were lived. Every birthday without Sherri. Every family gathering with an empty place where she should have been. Every reminder that the woman who built a career, married, and stepped into a promising new chapter had been reduced in official terms to a file with no resolution. And still, the case held on. Because evidence, even old evidence, does not always lose its power. Sometimes it simply waits for science to catch up. By 2008 and 2009, the landscape of forensic science had changed dramatically from what it had been in 1986. Techniques that once seemed limited had become far more powerful. Old evidence could now speak in ways it never could before. Cases dismissed as unsolvable were being reopened across the country. Biological traces overlooked for years were becoming pathways to names. In the Sherri Rasmussen case, investigators returned to one of the most significant details from the original crime scene: the bite mark. What had once been only an alarming sign of close contact violence now carried something even more important: preserved saliva. And inside that saliva was DNA. This is one of the reasons the case continues to fascinate. The answer, in a sense, had been present since the day of the murder. The evidence was there. The biological truth was there. But the tools to fully unlock it had not yet reached the level required to transform suspicion into proof. So when the evidence was re-examined decades later, the case changed instantly. Science cut through time. The saliva from the bite mark was analyzed. A DNA profile was developed, and that profile matched Stephanie Lazarus. After more than 20 years, the case was no longer floating in theory or emotional intuition. It had a forensic anchor. Not rumor. Not speculation. Not family suspicion alone. A biological link tying the violence of February 24, 1986, to the woman whose name had existed near the case from the beginning. The psychological impact of that breakthrough cannot be overstated. For the Rasmussen family, it was confirmation that the path they had pressed for years had not been imaginary. For investigators, it was a reopening not just of a case, but of a failure. And for the public, it transformed the story from a tragic old homicide into something far more explosive, because the DNA did not identify a stranger. It identified a police officer, a detective, a woman who had spent years inside the very institution that had never solved the murder. This is where the case achieves its full dramatic weight. The answer had been there since day one, locked inside the victim's final struggle. The crime itself had preserved the truth. All the years between the murder and the breakthrough now looked different, because the evidence had not truly gone cold. It had been waiting. And once that waiting ended, the case moved from suspicion to confrontation. In 2009, with DNA evidence pointing toward Stephanie Lazarus, investigators faced a crucial next step. They needed to speak with her, but not in a way that would immediately trigger total withdrawal or legal shutdown. They needed strategy. They needed patience. They needed a structure that would let her talk before she fully understood the danger she was in. So she was brought in casually. The setting, the tone, the pacing, all of it mattered. The detectives did not begin by slamming the table with accusations. They let the conversation breathe. They introduced the subject gradually. They allowed Lazarus room to speak, room to react, room to reveal herself through the small shifts that often matter most in an interrogation. This is one of the most studied and discussed parts of the case, because the interrogation itself became a psychological event. It was not only about what she said, it was about how she said it, how she responded, how tension surfaced when certain names and details entered the conversation. At first, she denied involvement. That was expected. But as detectives let the story unfold piece by piece, her comfort seemed to change. The more the conversation narrowed around John Ruetten, Sherri Rasmussen, and the history connecting them, the more the room seemed to tighten. Good interrogators understand that truth does not always arrive as a confession. Sometimes it appears in strain, in deflection, in surprise at what the detectives know, in the body reacting before the mouth can fully control the narrative. And that is what made this interview so gripping. They let her talk. They introduced the scenario gradually. They did not rush the tension. They built it. From the viewer's side, from the public side, There is something uniquely unsettling about watching a trained law enforcement officer sit across from detectives who already have the key evidence. It reverses familiar expectations. She knew interrogation environments. She understood investigative behavior. She had likely spent years on the side of authority. Now she was being drawn into the very structure she once represented. And the detectives already knew something she could not talk her way around. The DNA was there. That knowledge changed the room, even when it was not yet said directly in its full force. This chapter matters not simply because the interrogation was dramatic, but because it represented a turning point in power. For decades, the case had belonged to silence, delay, and institutional drift. Now it belonged to pressure, to confrontation, to the slow collapse of distance between the suspect and the crime. She did not walk into that room understanding that the old case had become immediate, but by the end of that process, the distance between February 24, 1986, and the present had nearly vanished. The past was no longer hidden in a file. It was sitting in the room with her. On June 5, 2009, Stephanie Lazarus was arrested. After 23 years, the case finally moved in the way the Rasmussen family had hoped it would. There is something almost surreal about an arrest coming that long after a murder. The passage of time does not reduce the seriousness of the moment. It intensifies it. Every year that passed becomes part of the arrest itself. Every missed opportunity, every unanswered question, every delay is present in that single act of handcuffing the suspect. For the public, the arrest was shocking. For the family, it was confirmation. For the justice system, it was a reckoning. Because this was not just the arrest of a murder suspect. It was the arrest of a former LAPD officer in the killing of a woman whose case had once been interpreted as a botched burglary. The original narrative collapsed under the weight of the truth. And once that happened, every earlier decision demanded re-examination. The arrest did not erase the lost years. It did not restore Sherri's life. It did not undo the pain of decades spent waiting. But it did something crucial. It forced the case back into the present. No longer an old murder file. No longer a family's unanswered grief. Now it was a live prosecution. Now it had a name attached publicly and legally. Now the system that had once failed to resolve the case had to confront it under the brightest possible light. In 2012, the case reached trial in Los Angeles County Superior Court. By then, the story had shifted from cold case mystery to courtroom reckoning. The central narrative presented to the jury was not random violence, not burglary gone wrong, but motive rooted in jealousy and unresolved obsession. The prosecution argued that Stephanie Lazarus' connection to John Ruetten and her inability to fully let go of that past formed the emotional core of the crime. Sherri Rasmussen was not just a victim of circumstance. She was the person standing at the center of the life Lazarus could not have. The evidence supporting that theory included the DNA recovered from the bite mark and the relationship history tying Lazarus to Ruetten. The bite mark was more than forensic detail. It was the bridge between the emotional and the physical. It showed that the violence had been intimate and direct, and it provided the biological evidence needed to identify the person who engaged in that struggle. The relationship history provided context. It explained why Sherri, specifically, could have become the target of such personal rage. It placed motive where the original burglary theory had erased it. In court, the case forced the jury to look backward across decades and reconstruct not only what happened, but why. And in doing so, the prosecution's theory transformed the murder from a crime scene mystery into a story of fixation, grievance, and escalation. A woman with a future. A former partner from the past. A marriage that made a final choice unavoidable. A confrontation that ended in homicide. When the verdict came, Stephanie Lazarus was found guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence, 27 years to life. For the Rasmussen family, the conviction was justice, but justice delayed on a nearly unbearable scale. For the public, it was a stunning outcome in a case already loaded with disturbing reversals. And for true crime history, it secured the case as one of the most memorable examples of a cold case solved through modern forensics, with the added shock of the killer being a member of law enforcement. But even a conviction does not end every question. It answers guilt. It does not always answer the deepest mechanics of motive, planning, or truthfulness. And in this case, those deeper questions would return years later in an unexpected setting. For decades, Stephanie Lazarus denied responsibility. Then, in November 2023, during a California parole hearing, she admitted that she had killed Sherri Rasmussen. On the surface, that sounds like final closure, a confession, an answer, a late acknowledgement after years of silence. But the deeper reality was more complicated. According to her account, she went to confront Sherri, and the situation escalated. In that version, the murder is framed less as deliberate execution and more as an emotional encounter spiraling into fatal violence. Yet this is where the case becomes unsettled again, because investigators and others familiar with the evidence did not simply receive her statement as the final truth. There were concerns that her version conflicted with the physical evidence. Concerns that even in admitting the killing, she might still be minimizing, reshaping, or protecting herself through narrative. This is one of the most psychologically fascinating aspects of the case. A confession is usually the end of uncertainty. Here, it became another layer of uncertainty. After decades of denial, she finally spoke. But not everyone believed her. And that matters because in true crime, confession is not always the same as transparency. Some confessions reveal, others manage. They concede what can no longer be denied while still controlling how the story is told. They accept responsibility in the broadest sense while resisting the full moral and factual weight of what actually happened. That appears to be the tension here. Did she finally tell the truth, or did she tell only the portion of the truth required by the moment? Was this remorse or strategy? Was it a genuine reckoning with what she had done, or an attempt to present the crime in a way more favorable to her as she sought release? These questions reopened emotional wounds for the Rasmussen family and renewed public interest in the case, because suddenly the story had a second twist. Not just that the killer was a police officer, not just that a cold case had been solved decades later, but that even after conviction, even after years in prison, the full narrative of the crime might still be under dispute. This is why the confession did not close the case in the way some expected. It complicated it. It forced everyone listening to decide whether the voice finally admitting guilt was also a voice still hiding from the complete truth. The years after that confession brought the case into yet another arena. Parole! In 2023, Stephanie Lazarus was initially granted parole. For the Rasmussen family and for many who had followed the case, that development was deeply unsettling. The idea that the woman convicted of murdering Sherri Rasmussen might leave prison reopened not only fear and anger, but also the old question of whether justice in this case had ever fully caught up with the damage done. Later, that parole grant was reversed. Then, in 2025, parole was denied again. Those decisions matter legally, but they matter just as much emotionally. Because parole hearings do more than assess behavior in prison. They force a public and a family to revisit the crime, the victim, the offender's account, and the question of whether remorse and truth have truly been demonstrated. For the Rasmussen family, opposition to release continued, and their position carried weight for a simple reason. From their perspective, the crime had already involved too many years without accountability, too many years of misdirection, and too many unanswered questions. A confession that seemed inconsistent with the evidence did not provide reassurance. It provided another reason for caution. So the parole battle became more than a procedural phase. It became a second struggle over the meaning of the case. Was the story now complete enough to justify release? Or did the unresolved gaps in Lazarus' account, combined with the severity and nature of the murder, mean that freedom would be another injustice layered on top of the first? That is why this chapter feels so contemporary. The murder happened in 1986. The arrest came in 2009. The conviction came in 2012. Yet the emotional life of the case did not end there. It continued into the present, inside hearing rooms, inside public debate, inside the voice of a family still carrying the original loss. Even now, the case is not finished. Because true crime does not always end with a sentence. Sometimes it continues wherever truth, remorse, punishment, and memory remain in conflict. Today, Stephanie Lazarus remains incarcerated. Her next parole possibility is in 2028, and that fact leaves this case suspended in a troubling place between resolution and uncertainty. On paper, the case was solved. The killer was identified. She was arrested. She was convicted. She was sentenced. Years later, she admitted responsibility. And still, one final question hangs over everything. Do we actually know the full truth of what happened inside that condo on February 24, 1986? That is what gives the case its lasting power. Not just the brutality, not just the cold case breakthrough, not just the shocking identity of the killer, but the possibility that even after all the legal milestones, something essential remains incomplete. Maybe the evidence tells us enough. Maybe the motive is clear enough. Maybe the arc from jealousy to murder to conviction is, in the end, the truest version available. But maybe there is still more hidden inside the spaces between the physical evidence and the later confession. Maybe the full emotional mechanics of that day were never completely spoken aloud. Maybe the final narrative remains fractured, preserved partly in forensic science, partly in courtroom findings, partly in family memory, and partly in the words of a woman who may still be telling only what she must. And that is the final disturbance of the Sherri Rasmussen case. A woman with a future was murdered in her home. A scene was left behind that pointed investigators in the wrong direction. A name surfaced early and went nowhere. A suspect stayed inside law enforcement for years. Science returned to the evidence and exposed the truth. Justice arrived, but late. Then confession arrived, but incomplete. So what are we left with now? We are left with Sherri Rasmussen's life. We are left with the persistence of her family, especially a father who refused to let his daughter's case disappear into the comfort of an early theory. We are left with a warning about how quickly investigations can harden around the wrong narrative. And we are left with a haunting possibility that in some cases, solving the crime is not the same as fully understanding it, she confessed. But investigators say the full truth may still be missing. And that may be the most chilling part of all. After all these years, one question still remains: did justice truly catch up with the whole truth, or only part of it? If this case shocked you, make sure you subscribe for more deeply researched true crime stories that uncover the details many people miss. And before you go, tell us in the comments, do you believe Stephanie Lazarus finally told the truth? Or do you think she's still hiding what really happened? Also let us know where you're watching from. Until the next case, stay curious, stay aware, and we'll see you in the next one. Here's a slightly darker, more cinematic version. Sherri Rasmussen lost her life in a case that remained buried in silence for decades. And even now, with a conviction, a confession, and years of investigation behind it, the full truth may still be out there. If you want more true crime cases told with detail, depth, and the twists that keep you questioning everything, subscribe to the channel now. Then head down to the comments and tell us, do you think this was a failure of investigation, or something even worse? And don't forget to tell us where you're watching from. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next case.